Hi, I'm Matt Norris. Welcome to episode 3 in this series. Firstly, some context. I did this painting in lockstep with the previous painting, the Tolkien one. I did both of their underpaintings together, and then about a week later I did their first coats, and several days later their final coats. And if you remember from the last video, in that painting I simply wanted to use the articulation dynamic to make the painting of so many leaves easier, but it ended up forming into a resolution play. But when I did the underpainting for this painting, I hadn't yet had for that first painting the revelation that it actually had a resolution play in it already. And so it was actually here when I started the underpainting for this painting that I was actually making my first attempt. And I did find myself feeling the pressure throughout the process as I tried to discern a composition that had such a thing as a resolution play. In this table I have 2 resolution play examples which I had seen in Frazetta paintings. There's also the one which I discovered in my last painting, although remember I was not yet aware of that when I started this one, so I might just leave that aside. So I had my 2 initial examples here. I also thought of a kind of third category where a dynamic render or articulation could be used to show a fading away of a person who was hit by a disruptor type weapon or some form of magic that kind of dematerializes them. So the dematerialization of a person or creature could be shown with a fading of detail. This seemed to be a bit more of an obvious category to me, and I hoped that I could come up with something a bit more original and surprising. But this dematerialization idea was on my mind. So as usual, I did my print, and here one of my discerning criteria was for perhaps something in the Robert E. Howard type genre, or pulp magazine genre, to stay in keeping with where I developed these ideas of dynamic articulation and resolution plays from. I saw a knight battling a troll in this first print, perhaps on an island, gotten to by a boat. I didn't really like the scale though. I normally want to be seeing something around this scale. I decided to wipe the surface and do a second print. Here I could see a Conan figure with a woman, here under the cover of a forest alongside a river, and perhaps some 4-armed alien type creature passing by on a boat in that river, and an abandoned overgrown pyramid type structure in the background. This idea was okay, but as I mentioned earlier, I felt under a fair degree of pressure during this underpainting phase, and where normally I might just roll with whatever I see, here I felt much more picky. I decided to wipe the canvas and do a third print. So I did a third print, but yeah, I really wasn't feeling it, so I put it aside for a few hours. And then later I saw the markings of some warriors around here, moving sort of upwards toward the left. I thought I could do something with that. I then figured that I could definitely place a Conan figure here that they are in combat with. This I considered quite cliche, but I was a bit stressed out, so I decided to just go with something ridiculous. In the Robert E. Howard short story, God in the Bowl, Conan threatens to stomp on someone's stomach with his boot. Conan is a fairly worldly and wise character, but he can also be quite brutal. I thought here that he could actually be stomping on someone's stomach as a kind of visceral gesture to disrupt an incoming attack from a group of enemy warriors. I felt at the time that I had somewhat failed to really come up with the sort of composition that I wanted to, and that this composition was a simple and perhaps silly fallback idea. I do become somewhat nervous, say, when trying to invoke Howard or Frazetta directly. I see such an act of being somewhat equivalent to invoking the gold standard, as it were, and in doing so it definitely adds some pressure or even a feeling of intimidation by the process, which I don't otherwise really get anymore when trying to discern forms or compositions from an oil print. So similar to how there was quite a gap between beginning my Tolkien-inspired painting and realizing that it had a resolution play feature in it, here too, in this case, it took about a day before I realized that there was a resolution play potential here as well. Now it somewhat falls into that third category of a person or creature fading away or dematerializing, but here the weapon was that visceral gesture of Conan. He's stomping on a man's stomach with his boot. I realized that I could make use of a dynamic render or dynamic articulation here to have perhaps the lower halves of these guys down here kind of fading away or dissolving as a representation of them having been taken aback or losing their resolve after seeing such an act. So a gesture that disrupts a person's resolve, that disrupts, I guess, what they are in that moment, a gesture that causes an identity upheaval in the intended victim of the attack. Now, the first painting I went into thinking I would do it as somewhat of a rough sketch. Here, though, I decided I could probably do more thorough job, perhaps increasingly so with each of these Evocation Realm paintings. I decided to have the scene take place in a dungeon, which actually caused a bit of an unanticipated problem. See, by having this guy's torch be the light source, the lower parts of these guys that were supposed to be fading away were now also in darkness. I guess if I did this painting with an even detail render, the same kind of metaphor for a fading away in these people could be done with a light or shadow play, with them simply falling away into shadow. So now I kind of had two kinds of plays overlaid, competing to make the same point. So this part where the legs or lower body parts of these guys were supposed to be fading away ended up being a bit, perhaps overly subtle. I did feel that with this and the Tolkien painting, I was being a bit tentative with really going deep into a really dynamic rendering of detail. I decided that for the third painting, I'd really have to force the point. But still here, there's some interesting ideas. I also kind of fitted in this kind of image of the man's soul, I guess, kind of being grasped out of him by Conan. Not suggesting that it was what was literally happening, but I guess with some loose brushwork, hints of such things or impressions of them can kind of find their way into the painting. So some interesting ideas for sure, but I definitely realised that I was being a bit too tentative going into a more dynamic rendering of detail. Interestingly, in both of these first two paintings, there's basically a complete overlap between the areas where I do have a falling away of detail and where the resolution plays are. I decided that in the next painting, though, I'd focus far less on the whole resolution play idea and simply just force the point of having an entire surrounding environment painted with a very rough level of detail. Maybe just focus on how a dynamic render is also useful for such a purpose, an impressionistic type of environment. Anyway, that's all I had to say about this one. Tune in next time to see how much I can push this whole dynamic rendering of detail, or I guess dynamic articulation of form idea. I'm still playing around with the terminology a bit. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you next time.